It's quite an honor and a challenge to make some opening remarks. I'm a little bit intimidated by this brain power. And of course, it's not about a lecture and not a political speech. I just want to make some deliberative remarks on our topic. I will start with the Corona crisis. What will be, or what is already the political impact of this crisis on our democracies, also on the, I would say, systemic competition internationally. If you're looking to China, China seems to be the champion in managing the Corona crisis. They have a full comeback economically. This is a huge challenge, I think, to liberal democracies in terms of output legitimacy. So which kind of political system is better equipped to deal with these kind of crises? This it's a global moment in this competition, systemic competition. So, but I very much agree with a remark by Timothy Garton Ash yesterday evening when he said probably Corona is not creating really new phenomena. It's kind of a catalytic factor on accelerator of already existing trends. And one of these trends is that big government is back. And even a little bit more specific and a little bit more critical, the trend towards the kind of executive state is been strengthened by the Corona crisis. In Germany, we have a very interesting debate just in these days that the opposition in parliament is demanding that the parliament should get back political sovereignty, and they are not longer willing to accept that all these decisions intervening in fundamental citizens' rights, the right to mobility, the right to education, the restriction on private life and on business life are only decided by executive bodies, the federal government and the state, the Länder governments in Germany. And you already saw this tendency towards the executive state in former crises in the last maybe 15 years. If I start with the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, it was a very similar experience. Dramatic decisions, not only on finance policies, had been made by the European governments, not by the European institutions, but by the national governments, and only later they had been ratified by the parliaments. And it was very similar in 2015 during the refugee crisis. This really astonishing move of Chancellor Merkel was a very lonely decision. Of course, it was approved by the cabinet of ministers, but there was not a big debate, and not at all a parliamentary decision on that. So obviously, in moments of crisis, this is the hour of the executive governments, and this trend has been accelerated now. And a second phenomenon related to that, it is about government by restriction. then restricting social life, restricting the public life, restricting economic activities, restricting mobility. I'll come back to that in a moment. If you take that as a kind of blueprint for climate policies, I think this is extremely misleading, not only because of democratic and liberal concerns, but also because this is not the way we would really be able to limit climate change to manageable proportions, so to keep it under 2 degrees warming globally, which probably may be the kind of threshold when things are beginning to spiral out of control. Maybe a third element, very interestingly to observe along with the kind of public debate and the political management of the Corona crisis, is what I would call the scientific illusion, or maybe even the scientific trap, that science has to tell us what to do. Of course, I'm far away from this kind of scientific skepticism to question the findings of the medical science if it comes to Corona, or the natural science, climate science when it comes to the environmental crisis. But it's a very interesting observation. You have this for the first time in Germany. It's really that some leading virologists and medical experts are seen as the authority which has to guide who has to guide political decisions. There's a huge coming out of scientists in the media as public persons, but at the same time, it is a very interesting learning process. First, of course, there is not such a thing like the science. Science in itself is pluralistic, and it's in a constant evolution. There are a lot of open questions still. There's a lot of ongoing debates within the scientific community, and of course then, because in the beginning it was the hour of the virologists, and then other scientific disciplines then came in, the psychologists. What is the impact of the lockdown on children if you keep them for weeks and weeks then at home? The economists, the economic impact of this kind of rigid regulation. So it is a learning process that science is a pluralistic world, and it's in a constant evolution. Interestingly, if it comes to climate policy, I would say we are still in the first stage. That if you listen to the kids from Fridays for Future, follow the science. And these are the most outspoken climate scientists with their demands, which policy only has to follow. It's if you have this kind of understanding of the relationship between science and politics, parliaments and governments are reduced to the implementation of science, of scientific findings. And I would say this is the abolishment of the very core, the meaning of the democratic politics, because this is always about conflict on alternatives. And so in the environmental movement, we have this kind of, there is a return of the neoliberal, there is no alternative, the Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative way of thinking. So, this is a very tricky question. So at the one hand, of course, we have to take these kind of scientific findings very, very serious, and downplaying the research on climate change is, of course, misleading and extremely dangerous. On the other hand, you have, I think we have to stick on the own right of politics, and that also the question how to deal with climate change cannot be finally answered by science. It has to be figured out in the public discourse, including the conflict of aims and values. That climate change is not a part or not above of this process of conflicting interests, values, opinions, and so on. But then in substance, if we come back to the what I called the government by restriction, there's a strong tendency also in the environmental movement and in green politics that restriction is the main tool to deal with climate change. So restricting production, restricting consumption, restricting mobility. So, and if you look to the climate impact of the Corona crisis, we had a really severe global economic crisis. Probably the global GDP will go down this year by maybe 5%, with dramatic consequences, especially in the developing world. You have, for the first time in 20 years, an increase of hunger, of a sharp increase of poverty. So, and at the same time, this economic recession of 5%, with almost closing down aviation in Europe and a lot of economic restrictions, we only have a decline of global CO2 emissions, maybe between 7 and 8%. But the goal we have to achieve, if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, is to reduce CO2 emissions by around about 90% over the next 20, 30 years. So the idea that you could go forward to climate neutrality by restriction is completely illusionary. It would really lead us into a kind of Pol Pot than policies. So of course, I'm not an advocate that we don't need regulation. We don't need a certain kind of restriction. This is not my the way of thinking. But first, we need to think about smart regulation. And smart means regulation which is creating incentives for innovation, for what I'm calling a new green industrial revolution, decoupling economic growth, decoupling prosperity from environmental degradation. Some people think this is pure wishful thinking, but I'm deeply convinced this is not only feasible, it's I think the only realistic answer to a growing world economy, growing world population, growing urbanization then globally. That we managed to decouple economic prosperity from environmental degradation by I would say, three fundamental processes. First, what we are calling the green energy revolution, departing from fossil fuels towards renewables, and in the future, kind of solar hydrogen economy. Second, efficiency revolution, making more out of less, creating more prosperity with less natural resources. If you think about modern light bulbs, you can save 70 to 80% electricity without any loss of comfort. These kind of things. And third fundamental move is towards a kind of zero waste recycling economy, economy in which every residual substance is returning either in the agricultural or in the industrial process. So this is an extremely ambitious, but in my view, it's also a kind of promising challenge. You know, it's about a new start. It's about an adventurous departure to deal with climate change, not in this sense, climate change is the revenge for human hybris, for overshoot of human economic activities, overshoot of consumption, overshoot of mobility. We have to shrink ourselves. We have to minimize our impact. No, it's about reinventing the industrial modernity and moving forward to kind of intelligent cooperation with nature. So I think this is maybe the promising part to finalize of the European Green Deal project. It's very much about investment in innovation. And if we want to keep climate change within the 2-degree limits, it is not about less, it is about more investments in restructuring our public infrastructure, rebuilding the energy system, the transport system, reconstructing the chemical industry, and so on and so forth. So it demands more investment and innovation, and the Green Deal could trigger this in the combination of public and private investments. But on the same time, it has a flip side, which I'm looking at quite critical. It could develop into kind of top-down kind of green planning economy. You are defining overarching goals and overarching reduction target, and then you are breaking it down. And every country, every economic branch with definite targets they have to fulfill into a certain time span, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years plan. So, and I think this is a kind of trap because we need much more flexibility, much more space for different solutions, for creativity. And maybe we will also need new instruments of carbon capture because we will not able to reach these reduction targets only by technological innovation. So I think carbon capture has to play a bigger role. And finally, I think it's the $100 question. If we will be able to turn this kind of ecological transition into an economic success story, to make it an economic success story, this is extremely crucial, at least in 2 dimensions. First, otherwise we will lose the societal consensus. We will lose the support of the society. If going green will mean we will slip into deep economic and social frictions. So we have to rebuild or to reconstruct the industrial apparatus by keeping it going on, avoiding then deep frictions, and making it a success story also internationally, because only when becoming climate neutral will turn out as an economic success story, it will become a kind of example for the big rest of the world, for all these countries for which economic growth and prosperity still are extremely important than goals and values. So for the whole developing world, this is absolutely crucial to combine the environmental protection with economic development and economic prosperity. And I think this is the big challenge to the European Green Deal. And if we manage to do that, I think we will be able to keep then our kind of liberal political approach to environmental protection, and not to slip in a kind of authoritarian environmental state. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this very rich opening statement, which really paints a very diverse and complex landscape. So one thing that I perhaps would suggest we focus on, I mean, we have an hour and a half, we'll have a break in the middle to talk about this. Perhaps I could suggest that we focus on one element of what you have been saying. You called up China, and this has been something of a recurring theme yesterday as well. I almost start thinking that this conference should have been focused on 3 C's, so Corona, climate, and China. The 3 challenges to the liberal democratic order. And as Timothy Garton Ash said yesterday, China's ideological alternative in this form of responsive authoritarianism is really tricky for us globally. And also, I think, you know, if we start by talking a bit about China and this tension between authoritarianism and liberalism, I think it helps us escape as very wishy-washy kind of abstract discussions of you know, combining liberalism with green political thought, which somebody could say rightly probably is a very academic way to approach this. Now, if you look at Hong Kong, and we almost forgot, I guess, Hong Kong, now that we have so many other problems on our heads. For Hong Kong, this tension between authoritarianism and liberalism is certainly not an academic debate. So what is at stake here, I think, is this problem of legitimacy and capacity to act. So this kind of the 2 things, and how we can provide liberty and solidarity, and at the same time mobilize ourselves for action. And there seem to be 2 responses. One is kind of the authoritarian response, and I do agree, and I'm sorry to say this, I hope I'm not misunderstood here, that there is something of an authoritarian seed within Extinction Rebellion and Fighters for the Future, in the way, exactly as you have said, they use the securitization of climate change, so putting climate change as this kind of utmost threat to humanity, which leaves almost no space for dissent and deliberation, and also this science-driven response. And I also saw with some, well, I'm slightly afraid personally of this notion of a scientific consensus, which is becoming quite popular right now, also in the Corona context. Because if you know the basics of philosophy of science, scientific consensus is almost an oxymoron. I mean, science is all about challenging a consensus. So if somebody mentions a scientific consensus, they're probably making a political statement. So this is kind of this, there's an emerging, well, politics of exception, this kind of Schmittian approach to politics, which basically says this is what we have to do, and we don't have time to talk about this. this capacity to act is kind of put first and foremost. Legitimacy is in a way implied. What would be the liberal response? Well, one thing that comes to mind, and I wonder if you agree, but maybe I'll just put this on the table, is more of what Hannah Arendt would call the politics of the extraordinary. Something which we know actually from Europe, from the post-war reconstruction of Europe, and also something that we know from Poland, at least from 1980, this Carnival of Solidarity. I would actually say that probably the best illustration of this politics of extraordinary was Angela Merkel's 2015 response to the refugee crisis, kind of epitomized by this phrase, "Wir schaffen das." Yeah, we can do it. But at the same time, I saw that you were critical, saying that this is an example of this executive-led response. But at the same time, perhaps the liberal response should be to kind of institutionalize this politics of the extraordinary, bring the state on board, and make the state something of a guardian of civil society energy, which has to be somehow bottom up, but at the same time has to be nurtured, so had to be kept aflame. Yeah, so that was kind of my immediate comment to this, and I'm really happy to open the floor now. If you would like to speak, I would be very grateful if you use this raise hand function or write on chat, put your questions on the chat.
Well, I would supplement maybe your question with another one, and then I think that Ralph Fuchs might respond to the to all of them. So my question would be, because you talked about this idea of smart growth, and this seems like an idea which is quite well, which might be well executable in a well-developed country. But is it also applicable globally? That would be my question.
Maybe if I should respond immediately, maybe it's even easier for the developing world to go green than for the old industrial countries, because they are still in the process of developing their industrial structure, developing their energy system, the transport system, their public infrastructure. So the lock-in effects are not so deep than in our societies. For instance, if you're looking to the enormous hunger for energy in the developing world, the dramatic fall of the cost for renewable energies enables them, and this is already happening if you're looking to especially Latin America and Asia, also some parts of Africa, to then develop their energy system based on wind and solar energy. So you can produce solar energy by photovoltaics in the southern regions with a high impact of solar for 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is much cheaper than building new coal-fired power plants. So I would say yes, it is feasible, and in the same way, it's I would say the only chance to avoid ecological collapse, because if you realistically expect the world economic output to double within the next 25 or 30 years, doubling of emissions, doubling of resource consumption would be simply a final blow to the global ecological systems we are all depending from. So I think the challenge is really to change the paradigm of economic growth in a very short time. And we in the highly industrial world, with all our scientific capacities, and I think we have to contribute to the solutions which are adaptable for the majority of the world.
I have 3 questions or comments from Paula Matei, Eugeniusz Smolar, and Piotr Kisel in this order.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph. I think this was really, for me, an eye-opening, talk. I have just one question and one comment. I start from the question. Well, I think in Italy, as in Germany, in France, executive decrees, executive order, ordinances, executive powers are related to the emergency state. And paradoxically, in Italy, it's the populists in opposition. It's the Northern League, which is such a paradox, isn't it? Which is now criticizing the government for an abuse of power, which I find quite striking. But I wanted to ask you, what principles do you think that as liberals, we should adopt to underpin emergency states? Because effectively, it seems to me that the governments are trying to react rapidly. And, the timing, the rapid solution seems to be necessary sometimes. But do you think some principles, some democratic liberal principles should underpin these emergency states, which we see, I suppose, not just in Germany, but also in other European democracies? And one comment to something you said, which I really think it's so important, and we should discuss that. You said that climate change is about conflicting views, and it's about conflicting values. So it's not just a rosy, dream future, but it's actually bears with it deep conflicts within society. And as an expert of social policy of the welfare state, obviously climate change presents to social policy huge challenges. It demands, for instance, investment, more investment. Clearly, it's needed, but that demands reallocation of government expenditure. For instance, to compensate victims, if I may use this term, to finance projects to offset the effects of climate change. For instance, in the Mediterranean, flood and sea defenses will become more important. Dams will become more important. In Africa and in parts of the Mediterranean, irrigation systems and investment will become more important. So all this is done to offset, the climate change emergency, but that will need some reallocation and redistribution of resources. I'm just thinking, we haven't, perhaps just the question I would like to raise is also the debate about climate refugees. I think perhaps living, in Italy and working and studying this, it seems to me that climate refugees may impose, sorry, I'm just using this as, as a frame, an additional burdens on social expenditure. At least this is also something that we need to think about. So this is just just wanting to follow up on what you said, that climate change will bring conflict and social divisions, and it will maybe be disruptive. So as you said, making it a successful economic development story is really a very important point. Sorry if I was too long, but I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you very much for this. Perhaps we could gather more questions and comments. So I have Eugeniusz Smolar, Piotr Kisel, and Joanna Derlikiewicz on the list, and then we might stop for a moment.
Climate change is an incredible challenge for the world's community and for the member states, for the European Union. And you rightly said it's about conflicting values, as it was already said. So if we are discussing here in the context of the liberal idea and the liberal approach, the only thing that might suggest leaving values conflicting values aside, is a very pragmatic approach, desideologization of the problem, because the moment when the left says something, the right responds in a less than attractive manner, and vice versa, and it becomes an ideological problem, and then the party political problem, and then it becomes unsolvable problem for the decision makers in the government. That's the one here. There radical change is badly needed, we all agree, but it has to be accepted by the electorate, as you rightly said. And this desideologization, I'm sorry, can help in the process, because it's not only the problem of legitimacy, it's also the process of social stability and economic stability. And actually presenting a perspective of change over the years with a very clear deadlines and you know, the roadmaps that the population can see the results of the policies and actually the cost of it. And here we come to the problem of legitimacy, and this legitimacy you cannot be found at the European level. It can mainly be found at the nation-state level. So it all depends about the politics of in the nation-states. Especially, we talk and we love a notion of the European Green Deal, but how much European Union can do with 1% of the GDP of member states? 99% is in the hands of the national governments and the legislature. So, you know, in order to be efficient in the approach, I would put a stress not just on a European context, which is badly needed, but about the politics in the member states and the cooperations and the pushing, you know, the whatever you can push, coalition of the willing, or the number of states that would like to go further than the whole of the European Union, and there are European mechanisms to do just that. And the last thing is the problem, which is for the liberals to consider, is a problem of something which everybody said, return of the government. And I believe it's a lot of bullshit, because the government was always there. The only problem is that what we have seen is a difference of approach exploited by the populists between the elites of the countries that gladly spoke using the European framework, and the electorate that see most of the things in the national context, or even sometimes the local context. And that drives the political choices. So if we have to, in order to be pragmatic and efficient in producing this European Green Deal and the Green Deal within the member states, we have to consider the fact that the politics is being done within the member states, and that the weakness of politics within the member states produces the weakness of politics at the European level. And the last but not least, but I think it is incredibly important, because in your introductory statement, you already have mentioned that, is the problem of well-being of the European population. And this is a big question. Do we have actually the money, considering also gentrification of Europe, do we have the money for all this expenditure, which are badly needed? This is a question about the welfare state, about the something which the American says are the entitlements. That means you mentioned the younger generation. The younger generation expects something which our generation got, which is a wonderful life, you know, security. I remember in the 70s in Sweden, where I've been living, there was a Social Democrats have been running an elections under the banner trygghet or säkerhet, which actually means the same thing, which means security, safety and security. And this is something which is badly damaging other needs. And I wonder whether the present coronavirus plague will not make us all more realistic and more pragmatic in our approach, and maybe also more active in the social and economic sense. I believe that might happen in Central Europe, because we never believed in the permanency of any structures. too many things have happened in the last, I don't know, 100 years, not to believe it, as Ivan Krastev rightly have mentioned that. So, you know, there is a lot of problem about politics, objectives, the presenting in a clear manner at the national, not necessarily European level, the roadmap towards the green paradise. Thank you.
Piotr Kissel, and then I have Joanna Delkiewicz, Karolina Wigura, and Karol Berger.
The speech of Sir Ralph was extremely interesting. I just see it's kind of from the European point of view.
Yeah.
One point I just would like to talk about and ask you a question about was you're focusing on restrictions. I'm not fully understand what I think we're talking about rules and government by restriction / rules.
Mm.
I would say restrictions and rules from my point of view, by observation of how business is doing, is a need.
Yeah,
it's definitely a need, and if we will not have a bar raised enough high, there's no reason to jump high. And I would say business will always go for it. As long as there is an existence platform, there is a point where we will be able to achieve. Of course, there's always the question how far we can go in terms of investments / restrictions. But already now, I can only talk about my perspective. Already now, I believe every single investment we're doing in the US is basically 25 to 30% relation directly to an environment rules perspective. So that's the only way. From the business, it's only way. But and I have to say, restrictions has to be they have to be smart. And I agree with you 100%. If they're not smart, we may end up, and I'm not criticizing California government, but we may end up with something like a California. The restrictions are very tough, and some of them are totally out of sense. Implementation is one of the difficult portion. And business, I'm talking a business for a low middle class and kind of a poor people level job related investments. They live in California, and the main reason they say it's the restrictions, because restrictions are not looking and they're not focused on how we can balance everybody. And that then we come into ambition, question about ambitions. Who is more ambition, a government or our citizens supposed to be ambition to follow understandable restrictions? If we're not in the same picture, there is a too big gap, and business will always suck those people, sometimes by populistic agenda, and they will follow them. They'll be against of the regulations because there's lack of understanding of the regulations, as long as they are not smart. And one of the point I can remind, and you are extremely intelligent participants, but all of you remember what George W. Bush said: we're okay with everything as long as the American style of life is not going to change. Okay. And we criticize America. Oh, okay, everything is okay as long as American life is not going to change. But my question is, are we European? Because I'm European. Are we also want to compromise our lifestyle? That's a question mark. I don't think so. By observation, I don't think so. We are very willing to change our lifestyle, observing how in certain countries we're not open for refugees from climate reasons. That's how we can call maybe down to the root why the Syrians refugee came from. Our middle class in China, are they not? Are they interesting to change their mind of their lifestyle? Remember, now it's a growing population of middle class. The middle class soon going to be larger than entire United States population. I don't think they will, as long as the regulations are not going to be smart on the global level. And that's my point. If the regulation is not smart and common, enter the global arena, and at least like a European Union, some kind of union between different countries are not similar and understandable, the competition is not fair. Mm. And there will always be somebody who will make things cheaper, smarter, faster, easier, and then business will move. And then the wave of populist is always following that. So that's kind of one of the things, and I would like to finish on this. And my most focused point was regulation, but also stability of regulation. Every government have a tend to change too many things, and observing you being in Germany, I would say you're lucky because you have kind of a path. Your government is not changing from election to election drastically, but even if they change, I do not observe that the path is damaged and everything what was before was criticized. In some other countries, it's like election by election, rules change dramatically, including the place where I am here now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, a lot of very interesting points there to digest for all of us. Joanna,
yeah, I think all of the comments were really interesting. I also would like to just raise the comment more than a question. I very much agree with what Eugeniusz Smolar said, that the whole discussion about the climate change, about the implementation of renewables into industry is very much dominated by ideology, I think. From the practitioner's perspective, this is also something which I stumble upon actually almost every day, considering the legislation being made. And just to give an example of that, because I think this illustrates this problem very much, is that I recently had a chance to participate in the process of the government working on amendments to the regulations which concern development of onshore wind farms and investments in onshore wind in Poland. Right now, these regulations are really strict. They have been changed by the Law and Justice government, and actually we've witnessed a really significant drop in these investments. And actually there were no serious plans to amending that, but recently the government has come up with an idea of modifying these regulations to make them more lax. But actually, when I witnessed this discussion about the proposed amendments, I had the impression that this discussion is very much dictated by ideological convictions, by a little bit populist approach towards the arguments which are going to make people less scared of this kind of technologies, for example, growing near their houses. I very much had the impression that the legislation is not very much dictated by any kind of scientific data, or doesn't take into account the economic perspective whatsoever. Basically, the justifications for the implemented regulations were simply based on some kind of weird researchers from 10 years ago stating that the turbines might explode. So this is very interesting for me, how much the legislation, and being a very significant part in the whole climate change, reaching the renewables targets discussion, how much this is actually dictated by ideological convictions less than any kind of scientific consensus. And I think this is all for me.
Thank you very much for this, Joanna. Carolina, your turn.
I just wanted to delve a little bit into into Ralph's optimism, which I share. I couldn't be more on your side, Ralph, when I talk about politicians and the need of political agendas to create hope for the future and not only skepticism. But I would like you to tell us, where would you see the fuel? Because whereas after the Second World War, it was a rather general conviction that the past is the source of skepticism and darkness, and the future is the source of hope. We now live in a quite different era, aren't we? The past seems to be the place where we search for comfort. And of course, illiberal politicians are manipulating this with their projects. And the future seems like in Alexis de Tocqueville's book, the source of dark depths. And it is partly, of course, such emotions about the future are partly, of course, present in how the right, the conservatives, are seeing the future. Namely, they would talk about the end of traditional family, the end of European values, etc., etc. But also those who defend the climate, for example, when you delve into what the supporters of the Fridays for the Future, for example, tell us, they basically also share the fear of the future, because they tell us this is the end of the world. So where would you see the fuel to spread hope for the future? Because I do share your conviction that the ones who will be able to create political ideas and agendas bringing hope for the future will be the ones that will be also able to seize and hold power within the next months and years.
Thank you, Carolina. Let's give Ralph a chance to respond, because many of those comments were actually questions to him. So before he is completely overloaded by this.
Thanks a lot. Of course, I will not be able to respond to all the comments and questions, but take much too long and overstretch my role. I would like only to pick some challenging comments. If I start with Carolina's question from the end, I think my answer would be it's very much about two elements. The first, we have to restore a sense of progress, that progress is possible, and to develop a vision of progress, or maybe speaking in the plural, visions of progress. And the whole idea about this term of the Green Industrial Revolution is to create a narrative, I would say a substantive or a substantiated narrative, that no, environmental protection is not about to go back, it is about to go forward. I like very much Kaspar's initial comment that he was reminding us to what I would say the Obama language of yes, we can. Yeah, this is the spirit, the yes, we can spirit that we need to create this kind of confidence that we can manage these really serious challenges. It's not about only climate change, it's digital revolution, global migration, whatever, that we can manage to deal with these challenges in a kind of confidential way. Yeah, to have confidence in our ability to create a better future. And of course, this is not just about preaching in the cathedral. This is about developing concepts and strategies convincing ideas and realistic ideas how to do it. And at the same time, this would be the second part of the answer, also referring to other comments. We have to find liberal answers to what I would call conservative demands, especially the demand for a certain, I would say, degree of security, of social safety, of belonging, also of stability, of biographical circumstances, yeah, a certain kind of stability in your personal life. So the question of security in times of rapid and fundamental change, this is absolutely crucial. And to find liberal answers to that, part of course, the traditional answer would be we have to empower people. Yeah, we have to empower people by education, by qualification, to keep pace with the technological and structural change. Also mentally, to feel as kind of subject of change and not just object of change. But this is not enough. I think still the empowerment story is important. But at the same time, we need strong public institutions capable to also to protect, to a certain degree, people from the fallout of disruptive change. Social policies, regional policies, whatever, to offer compensations to those who will lose their jobs and their qualifications will be devaluated, whatever. So I think this combination of a forward-looking, optimistic approach, this yes, we can approach, and at the same time to give answers to serious concerns of people. Yeah, what will change do with us and our livelihoods? Another comment I would like to respond briefly is about rules and regulations. Of course, I totally agree that, of course, we need rules and regulations, and markets need rules and regulations. The question is which kind of. It's not if or not, it's which kind of. Yeah, and basically, I would say the economic root cause for the climate crisis and large parts, not all of them, of the environmental crisis is the externalization of environmental costs. This is the basic economic problem, and we have to reframe markets in a way that environmental costs will be integrated in the calculation of businesses and investment decisions, also consumer decisions. So using the price mechanism as a regulatory instrument, this is one of the basic, I would say, liberal answers to the regulatory challenge. And if you look to the European Union, the emission trading system, this is, I would say, kind of hard and at the same time smart regulation, because you limit the amount of CO2 emissions and you are reducing it then every year to a certain portion. So you are creating long-term expectation security for businesses, for investors. But at the same time, you leave it to the markets to find smart solutions to this reduced CO2 budget. And the alternative, and in the moment in the European Union, we are doing both in parallel. Yeah, we are using this kind of price mechanisms, and at the same time, you have a strong tendency to very detailed regulation, yeah, to nitty-gritty regulation, every kind of chemical substance, every even should we make political decisions about which kind of transport technologies will be allowed in the future? Yeah, should we by political decision phase out the combustion energy, or should we create or should we put emissions targets, which then the industry have to find the smartest solutions to? And the lifestyle question, I'm far away from arguing that changing our lifestyles doesn't matter. Of course, it's also a question of lifestyles. For instance, if you look to meat consumption, the amount of meat consumption we have in Europe and the US is not at all sustainable. It is not. You cannot globalize it. This is not a standard. Billions and billions of people could make use of. So, but what is the narrative? Is it about, no, we have to go frugal, we have to restrict ourselves, or is it, no, there's another better and smarter way of eating? More healthy, but not less delightful, not less tasty. So I think it is more about, we do it different and smarter, and not about this less or more. Less or more is a trap. It's a different kind of quality. Even also, if you're looking to mobility, should we really try to restrict mobility, which is an achievement of the modernity, to expand individual mobility? This is liberty, and this is creating global connections. This is creating a global society. So no, it's not about restricting mobility. It's about making mobility smart, and even make the car sustainability smart, and make aviation smart by replacing fossil fuels by synthetic fuels based on renewable energy. So it is not about this, what I call not, let us not trap ourselves in this kind of restriction narrative. It's about finding better alternatives. Yeah? And for this, of course, you need rules and regulations as incentive for innovation, as you rightly pointed out. And maybe the last point, with the emergency state, this is a very critical term. So of course there are situations of public emergency. You have to act swiftly and in a decisive way. But at the same time, we need to maintain space for public deliberation, for second thoughts, for the debate on alternatives, for a critical review of government decisions. And this is partly the role of the parliament. We have to strengthen parliaments and not to weaken parliaments in these kind of emergency situations, that parliaments really will be the place, not for the single decisions, no, but for discussing, I would say, the key points or the guidelines for the government. Yeah, in which kind of direction should we move? This should be decided by the parliament, and the parliament should review governmental decisions, should have control on government decisions. This is an extremely important part. And the other one, of course, is the public sphere of debate and deliberation, and the role media are playing. So yes, there are situations of emergency which need kind of decisive actions, but not on the expense of the liberal public space.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Karl Berger to to make his comment, and sorry for keeping you waiting so long.
It seems to me that we are discussing these two crises, the climate change and corona crisis. Liberal answers to these crises will be relevant only if liberals find ways of staying in power in those countries in which they are in power, or regaining power in those countries in which they have lost it. Very broadly and simple-mindedly speaking, we have a world in which liberals compete for power with authoritarians. So I have two very closely interrelated simple questions. Which of these two camps will be more successful in dealing with these two crises? And the second distinct but very closely related question, which of these two groups will benefit more from these crises?
Thank you very much. Interestingly and provocatively.
I have the question, in fact, two questions to Ralph. The first one is that we are talking about this new virus, and I think that I've got the impression that we are using the old vocabulary. So new virus, old temptations, authoritarian temptations, or illiberal temptations. And my question is that, do you see that, what is your opinion on the subject of, on the possibility that we have some new tensions, some new political tensions in the agora? Why am I asking? Because we see some new political movements that are extremely exotic. We are trying to frame them according to some previous patterns. I mean, sogenannte Covidioten. Before we had Gilets jaunes that were very difficult to be framed according to old patterns, including the Green Deal. In fact, what we remember is that, in fact, it was the pro-ecological solution that triggered the Gilets jaunes wave. So my question is, do you see new political tensions in the air? Or we have the old problems and we should proceed with them as we have already discussed. And the second question is in the line of Eugeniusz Smolar, that should there be in 2020 some minimal democratic conditions for the EU Green Deal, for the green politics? Why am I asking? Because it is far from being obvious. For example, we have published a book by David Runciman, and among other things, he's considering that there might be some authoritarian temptation on the side of pro-ecological movements. This is not only speculative, this is based on the assumption that, in fact, if the main reason for political action is impatience, we could be tempted by some authoritarian solutions for they could be quicker and more effective, as it was proved on several occasions in China. That's David Runciman line, his line of argument. And I would like to know your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Karolina, you had a question, comment.
I had an ad vocem. So if there is a little bit space, I will just say very briefly, because it was connected with Ralph's answer about how we search for fuel for hope. And of course, I do agree with all what you have said, connected to both agendas and ideas and strategies. I just wanted to pose one more philosophical question, because this thought has become central to me lately. Namely, the climate change is a kind of loss, and it is an ongoing loss. ongoing loss, and I do believe this is extremely important, that it's ongoing. Because if you philosophically compare recovering from loss to recovering from bad deeds in the past, and if you compare the grief which is connected with loss to a process similar to forgiveness, then it starts to be really philosophically tricky. Because whereas you can forgive past deeds, it is not always possible, but at least there is this possibility, potence of forgiveness, of past deeds, of evil that has happened and it's closed. But when you have ongoing evil, it's not as easy at all. It's another philosophical problem. Now, when you talk about when we talk about the loss of climate, it is an ongoing loss, and it's extremely bitter. And I wanted to just delve a little bit more here. How would you see a possible answer to this?
Who will be more successful and who will benefit from climate change and the COVID-19 crisis? I think, okay, finally it will depend on our ability to act. And in the moment, China seems better equipped. I would say in the moment, China seems to be better equipped to deal with these kind of crises, with this, is there something like smart authoritarianism or even enlightened authoritarianism? There are some very prominent environmentalists openly sympathizing with the Chinese model because they don't believe that liberal democracies, parliamentary democracies will be able to create this kind of long-term determination and to implement long-term politics. Their reading is parliamentary democracies are always about short-term benefits and short-term calculations of interest. It's always the next elections. It's always so short-term return on investment. So I would say the ability to create this kind of long-term policies and climate change is about the long term. It's not about just the next year and the year after next year. And to then develop the necessary societal consensus that, as it was already mentioned before, not every election is changing the whole policies and the whole strategy. No, you need a kind of long-term consensus, bipartisan or then across the political camps, that we have to follow certain pathways. And at the same time, this is my hope, it's an open bet, that liberal democracies on the long run will be more creative, will be more innovative than authoritarian regimes, because of the competition of ideas, of the pluralism of actors, the multitude of societal actors, and the openness for criticism and self-reflection. I think this is the basic assumption that liberal democracies or I would say that freedom is at the same time the most important resource for finding creative solutions for the crisis of modernity. And we have to prove that this is the case. This is not a hollow, but a real connection between freedom and innovation. And but at the end, it's about output legitimacy. I totally agree. It will be about output legitimacy. Yeah, also, I'm not sure if I really got your questions. I would like you ask: are there new political phenomena and movements, or is it just the old problems then returning?
Maybe I will just repeat the questions.
Yeah.
The first question was, do you see any new political tensions, fractures that should be named in a different way, that we should be more open to see new political tensions in the times of COVID-19? And the second question was about the minimal democratic conditions for the green politics in 2020. That is the question that is so relevant for us.
To the second question, I just would refer to a previous comment of mine when I said what is the we have to defend the set of the liberal political order with the role of parliaments, with the role of the free media and a vivid civil society. So for me, it's not so much about inventing new rules, but more defending this kind of institutional setting of a liberal democracy, also in times of crisis and emergency, and not to give up these checks and balances and this kind of pluralism, to sacrifice it on the altar of climate emergency or COVID-19 emergency. I think the first part is more difficult to answer. Of course, I see new kind of political frictions and conflicts, and this is not just my personal findings. We have a lot of books and essays over the last years on the populist challenge, and this is not just the old left-right or the old social conflict between upper class and working class people. No, it's across the old political lines, and this is what I'm most interested in to better understand what are the new dividing lines, what are the new conflict lines in our societies. If you, for instance, look to in Germany to the right-wing populist and more right-wing extreme party, the Alternative for Germany, these are not the marginalized people. Maybe these are people who are afraid of social decline, but it's much more complicated and much more complex. What are the motivations, more cultural aspects than in it? So I think we have to better understand the new dividing and conflict lines in our societies. When I'm looking to the COVID-19 protests in Germany, really mass protests against the COVID-19 restrictions, partly it's, I would say, the old alternative movement you can see there. It's not just right-wing militants. It's a very puzzling and very strange alliance of people demonstrating on the streets and reclaiming freedom very interestingly, they are reclaiming freedom, their personal freedom, against this kind of emergency regulations. And Carolina, yeah, of course, you can read the environmental crisis both as a kind of punishment for our former sins, but I wouldn't not frame it in this way, not in this kind of moralistic way. I would say climate change and most part of the environmental crisis is the result of a certain kind of industrial system, a certain kind of production system based on fossil fuels and excessive consumption of natural resources. And so I would like to find the answer in just changing the patterns of the industrial system of our energy, the way we are gaining energy, the way we are organizing than our industries. And this would, for me, would be an element of hope that, repeating myself, to restore an idea of progress. In a philosophical way, I would say it's about a new kind of relationship to our natural environment, of relationship between human society and nature. The idea is of co-evolution. This is almost a religious idea, I would say, a co-evolution of mankind and nature, and not developing human civilization on the expense of our natural systems. A kind of intelligent synthesis or intelligent cooperation. Ernst Bloch, very, very early, he coined the phrase of, he said, alliance technologies. So creating alliances or between the industrial system and the natural system. We could go deeper into that, but so this is maybe an utopian element in it. And at the same time, of course, we have to be very serious is to stop these constant losses, to stop this constant loss of biodiversity, the constant loss, the constant acceleration of global warming. This has to be a serious goal, not just to live with the losses, no, to stop this kind of loss and maybe even to turn it around in a richer future and not in a future of constant loss.
Thank you very much for this. I will say something now. I was supposed to give the second comment, but since the dynamics of this seminar was slightly different, instead of making this kind of statement, I'll try to more react to what has been said and gather some of the threads that have emerged. Firstly, I would like to respond to some very interesting points raised by Piotr Kissel, and I think we could think and talk about this a bit more. I mean, you raised this question of regulation and the need of stability of regulation. And I think this is really a very, very interesting point here. I was at some point doing a research project where we asked energy-intensive companies how they would imagine a climate policy to which they could relate and to which they could kind of contribute. And to our great surprise, they almost unanimously told us that they would prefer a climate tax. Now, raised in Poland, where taxation and business are not necessarily things that you associate with each other, I was really surprised by this. gobsmacked, really. But they said, well, actually, no, a climate tax is something you can work with. It's something we can put in our longer term strategies and something that we can adjust to and something that we can build our investment visions on. So this is something that we actually need. You know, we want to go in a certain direction, but we just have to know in advance which direction we're supposed to go in. And I'd like to come back to one thing that was really not so often mentioned today, which is the European Green Deal, which also has a slightly different American equivalent in the form of the Green New Deal, raised by the Democrats, or at least some among the Democrats. The European version is very much about creating not just, or like a double-edged sword there. On the one hand, you have a long, holistic strategy for making Europe more sustainable, where you're sending a strong signal to all the sectors of the industry that this is the way we're going, and basically you are asked to contribute and you are asked to adjust. The other thing about the European Green Deal is also that it's supposed to be something of a normative vision. Now, we generally tend to, especially if we're discussing things like liberalism, we tend to think of the European Union as a normative power. But we should not forget that Europe is very much an economic and a regulatory power as well. Now, it's the second or third largest economy if you take all the EU countries together, after China and the US. But very importantly, if you look at manufactured goods trade, so imports and exports, it's still the largest market for manufactured goods in the world. So whatever the European Union does in terms of its regulation, it's influencing everyone in the world, because basically everyone is Europe's trade partner. I mean, apart from North Korea. Or even there, I mean, if you've seen the latest documentary. So the fascinating thing about the Green New Deal, or European Green Deal, is that it might create something that we can call a climate club. So project European power to regulate outside its borders. And this is a really interesting vision, because it also raises a lot of questions which are beyond kind of the realm of economics. Basically, the idea there is that Europe creates a certain set of internal regulations, but if you want to have access to this largest market in the world, you also have to adjust your regulation to those. Otherwise, you're going to be faced with border adjustment payments, which are going to be something of a penalty for not being part of the club. And this is really a tremendous change if that is ever managed to be put through. However, this doesn't really address the tension between authoritarianism and liberalism that we've been discussing, because China can very well adjust European climate regulations without doing anything on the political and human rights dimensions. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing, responding more to what Karl Berger hinted at, we've been growing used to thinking, that there's a wave of populism, something that is kind of moving across the world, especially Central Eastern Europe, US, Brazil. Yeah, I just see that the trough has to leave. So if you would like to make some final comment now, I will give you the floor. If not, I'll just continue.
I just apologize that I have to leave. I have to run to another meeting. So thanks a lot, and I would like very much to stay in touch and to continue our conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here, and also thanks to Maciej Zakrotsky, who also has to leave. Yeah, so returning to this, we've been thinking about the populist wave. However, what we tend to omit is that there's also another wave which has been sweeping, particularly Europe. And this is actually this green liberal wave, which is not a myth at all. if you look at the electoral results of green political parties and what we might call social liberal parties, so kind of the centrist parties, who have now reclaimed a lot of the environmental agenda from the Greens. And if you add the two together, they usually outpace right-wing populists, often by a factor of 2 or 3. And if you want evidence of this, well, look at the last important climate policy vote in the European Parliament at the beginning of October. We had this vote on increased emissions reductions target, 60%. And this was passed, well, to a large extent by the Green political faction and by Renew, which is the Liberal political faction, where some members, like the Czech ANO movement, which is not really a liberal party in the conventional sense of the term anyway, they have dissented from the Renew line, but there is a visible alliance of those green and liberal forces. So I do agree that we can talk about what liberals can do only if they are in power, but we should not underestimate the power of this green liberal coalition and the power that is already building in many national parliaments and governments. Here in Norway, where I'm based, the traditional agrarian liberal party, if you can believe that, Venstre, is usually winning all the comparative assessments of who is the most environmentally friendly or most environmentally ambitious political party, and it's outpacing the Greens. So it's a political fact. It's not a fantasy and not something of a political utopia, actually. I see a reaction from Piotr.
I would like to thank you for your comment and about tax. Interesting. We'll love the tax, but definitely must be good if there will be well spent towards environmental protection. If it's not going to be that way, then it'll be another tax people will hate. Green Deal, definitely good point you catch. We have something here and we have something in Europe. My problem about Green Deal is it become too political. I mean, it has to be in terms of the political interest in that, but I don't think it should be a point of choice, because the Green Deal is not a portion of choice. It's just the only way we can go. And a good example from Norway, absolutely right. We should compete who is more green, and not who is against that. To combine with what you have been saying earlier about China and all this changes happen and political wave of election to election is like you mentioned earlier. Yes, we can. Yes, we can was 10 years ago, and recently we have yes, we can make America great again. And that's the story why things changing and why people don't believe that. My only experience is most people are understanding the COVID crisis and precautions we should have. Okay, why they against? Because the restrictions are not understandable. And the same is with the Green Deal. The restrictions are not understandable for many people, and the alternative is just dark. People hate to go dark. People everything we understand and receive from some of the restriction government is not explanation. It's just the limitation. And if we come with a COVID into relation of limiting our freedom by wearing masks, it's like nonsense. But that's the response from the populist. So whoever managing the restriction for Green Deal needs to be extremely smart with presenting alternatives and and expressing this the way that there is nothing to talk about. It's like nobody's talking about canalization and drainage system. Okay, it's not political. It's just everybody knows we have to have it. 100 years ago, it's not normal. Now it's normal. How to make these things out of fighting political arena and just be a regular human target, just to be there. There's no other way than the Green Deal. Doesn't matter where we're talking. We can see how China is changing their direction into be more environment friendly. It's happening all over the world. So I believe Liberian, and that's why I think Kultura Liberalna is doing a greatest job, is balancing the emotion and do it in a smart way, representing every aspect of life and not making things in a drama, but just like it is. That's the real truth, and that's how we have to go. That's only a comment to to your Green Deal. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. We have roughly 12 minutes to wrap up. So I very much encourage, especially those who have not participated yet, to comment before I also try to make some kind of a closing statement. Monika Juszczyk.
Yes, hello. If may add some points maybe to the discussion. That okay, today we are dealing with the COVID actually. However, I think we have to keep in mind also that maybe in the future we can be prepared for any other disasters or catastrophic things which can come, and even it can be coming from the climate change, of course, but it can be also from the other aspects of nature or any other diseases. So I think we have to also keep in mind and probably find some balance between also the expectation of the society, expectation of the climate, and expectation of the governments. I think it's very difficult, and well, it's for sure to think over for the near future, I'm afraid. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm seeing that Paula has to leave us soon. I'll just use the opportunity, if I can, before you leave, to say that I found your question about what principles we should adopt to underpin the state of emergency to be really fascinating. I wish I had the answer to this.
Thank you. No, just quickly, as I think it is, I mean, governments clearly need to be given the capacity to act quickly. And therefore, it's inevitable that some emergency powers will need to be granted to central governments for that. Otherwise, it's about capacity. But at the same time, well, just a proposal, a suggestion. I think, in my view, I mean, emergency power needs to be based on, need to have a legal basis. I think that's quite important. First, I would say emergency powers need to have legal basis grounded in national laws. I would say, I don't know if you agree with that, but that would be the base, one of the basic fundamental principles. The second one could be that they need to serve a legitimate aim. So if the government calls upon them, it's to serve a legitimate, maybe a constitutional right. The protection of public health of citizens seems to me, a legitimate aim. And thirdly, I think at least in Italy, but in other places, it needs to be a time. It needs to be limited. There needs to be, it's not an unlimited state, but it needs to be limited to a certain specific time. And that's very important. So what we are discussing at the moment in this country is how long should we have this for? You know, now the emergency state has been in place since March. So is it really what, does that correspond, you know, to the principle of a time-limited state of affairs? So I don't know, these are just three suggestions. But I'd be very interested also about some comparative, research on that, because I think each European democracy has probably different principles. So I think it would be quite interesting to do a comparative study,
What is striking for me is if you look at this, this seminar we had today from a distance is that we've been discussing the need for a larger role of government, the need for regulation. We've been talking about solidarity, and we've been talking about inequality. It's almost hard to believe, if you look from afar, that this is actually held by liberal think tank or community. At the same time, I think, and I'd like to come back to something that Tomasz Sawczuk said yesterday. I mean, we know that liberalism is evolving. It's evolving because it's not just a politically abstract idea which is being developed in the void. It's responding to external stimuli, and the environmental crisis and the social crisis are surely two that have to be dealt with somehow. So what we are seeing is, I believe, something of a watershed moment for liberal thinking. But in a way, again, it's not something that we haven't seen before. It seems to me that what we're discussing now is very much in the spirit of this kind of mid-20th century liberal ideas, which were, which gave us the initial New Deal. So not the Green New Deal or the European Green Deal, but this kind of Rooseveltian Green Deal, New Deal. And I think that perhaps it's high time to really expand the scope of liberal thinking, and perhaps we are indeed in a good position to do this. Also because Central European liberals in the 1980s already had a working political alliance with green and environmental movements in the West. So again, we're kind of making smaller circles and larger circles here. Not sure if Jaroslav Kuisz is going to be happy about this, because it almost sounds like we're returning to older known scripts, even though we're facing apparently new threats. But then again, are we really facing completely new threats, or are we just facing new incarnations of things that we have already known before, like this ideological competition with China, or precisely the climate challenge, which again resembles some things that we've already seen earlier. Thank you very much for today. And well, I was really happy to listen to so many different perspectives and so many different voices. Thank you all very much, and well, have a great rest of the day.